Melissa Parker was the last person anyone in Ridgewater suspected. Two neighbors, she was just another quiet mother raising her little boy, Ethan, a 4-year-old known for his red tricycle and shy smile. But when Ethan vanished one warm afternoon and later turned up in the dark waters of Ridge Lake, investigators uncovered a truth so chilling it shook the town to its core. This wasn't the story of a child who wandered too far. It was the story of a mother who led him there. Ridgewater was the kind of place people described as safe, quiet, and predictable. A town where families left bicycles on lawns overnight without worrying, and where the sound of church bells on Sunday mornings was the loudest thing you would hear all week. For years, life in Ridgewater had followed the same rhythm, children running through sprinklers in the summer, neighbors swapping pies during the holidays, and old men gathered outside the corner store to talk about fishing. It was the sort of place where bad things only ever happened somewhere else, on the evening news or in the pages of crime novels. That belief would be broken the day 4-year-old Ethan Parker disappeared. Ethan was the youngest child on his street, a boy with messy blonde hair and a love for toy trucks. People remembered how he would ride his little red tricycle back and forth on the sidewalk, waving at passing cars. On the day he went missing, it was warm and sunny, the kind of afternoon when most children would be outdoors. Melissa Parker, his mother, later told police she had let Ethan play in the yard while she folded laundry inside. She claimed she stepped away for just a few minutes, and when she returned, he was gone. At first, no one panicked. Children sometimes wandered off to chase a dog or follow a butterfly, and usually they came running back minutes later. But as the hours passed and Ethan did not return, unease began to spread. Melissa knocked on neighbors' doors, asking if anyone had seen him. Some joined her in calling out his name, checking driveways and sheds, while others dialed the police. Before long, patrol cars arrived, and the search expanded into the wooded trails that curved behind the Parker house. By dusk, word had spread across Ridgewater. Volunteers gathered with flashlights and walked through the darkening forest. Parents who had tucked their own children safely in bed showed up to comb the area around Ridge Lake. A helicopter circled above, its searchlight sweeping across fields and water. Despite the growing effort, there was no sign of Ethan. The longer he was missing, the stranger the situation seemed. Ethan was known for being cautious. He didn't like being far from home and was easily frightened by loud noises or unfamiliar places. Neighbors whispered that it didn't make sense for him to suddenly vanish on his own. Still, hope lingered. People told themselves he was probably lost in the woods, waiting to be found. Others believed he might have wandered into someone's backyard and fallen asleep under a tree. As midnight passed, the search continued, but tension was rising. Police dogs traced faint scents through the grass, only to lose them near the road. Divers scanned the lake but reported nothing unusual. Melissa stood on her porch with folded arms, staring at the commotion around her. Some thought she looked stunned, while others quietly remarked she seemed oddly detached. In a town where everyone knew each other, even small details were noticed. No one said it out loud that night, but an unspoken fear was spreading. This wasn't going to end the way they hoped. 2 long days passed before the nightmare reached its breaking point. On a gray morning, when the search had already begun to feel endless, a local fisherman noticed something unusual near the reeds at the far edge of Ridge Lake. At first, he thought it was debris, maybe a bag caught in the current. As he moved closer, his stomach dropped. What he saw was the small, lifeless body of a child. He called the police immediately, and within minutes, the area was swarming with officers. Word spread quickly, traveling faster than anyone could prepare for. By the time the coroner arrived, most of Ridgewater already knew the truth. Ethan Parker had been found. The lake was still and silent, the surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a breeze. Officers moved carefully, collecting evidence along the muddy shoreline. Yellow tape was stretched across the area to keep people back, though curious neighbors gathered at a distance, their hands pressed to their mouths in shock. Parents clutched their children tighter, whispering that they could never imagine such a thing happening here. For many, the sight of a little boy taken from the water was too much to bear. At first, investigators leaned toward the simplest explanation. Ridge Lake was large, deep, and ringed with steep banks. It was not uncommon for people to lose their footing near the water. A small child could easily wander too close, slip, and drown without anyone hearing a sound. It seemed like the kind of accident that could happen to any family in any town. Yet almost immediately, small details began to challenge that version of events. When detectives spoke with Ethan's relatives and friends of the family, they learned that he had always been afraid of water. Melissa herself had told others that he would scream and cry if asked to dip his toes in the lake during summer outings. Neighbors remembered how he would sit far back from the shoreline, clutching his toy truck, refusing to join the other children splashing in the shallows. It did not make sense that Ethan, of all children, would wander willingly into Ridge Lake. The medical examiner's early findings only added to the unease. While Ethan had clearly drowned, there were no signs that he had slipped on rocks or tumbled into the water unexpectedly. There were no scrapes on his legs, no torn clothing, nothing to suggest a fall. The boy's body seemed strangely clean, as though he had been placed directly into the lake. Detectives began to piece together the timeline of the day he disappeared. Witnesses said they had not seen Ethan walking anywhere near the water on his own. No one recalled hearing splashing or cries for help. The conclusion that had first seemed so straightforward was no longer certain. If Ethan had not fallen in by accident, then how had he ended up in the lake? Investigators returned to the beginning, looking closely at every moment of the day he went missing. As they retraced each step, one thought began to grow louder in their minds. The answer might not be about where Ethan wandered, but about who had taken him there. As detectives dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding Ethan's death, their attention began to shift from the lake to the home he had come from. At first, Melissa Parker was treated as a grieving mother who had suffered a tragic loss. She was offered comfort, compassion, and space. But the more investigators learned, the more unsettling details began to surface. Neighbors who had initially described her as quiet and reserved started sharing observations that painted a different picture. Several recalled how she seemed strangely composed during the frantic search for her son, while others were calling out Ethan's name. Stumbling through the woods with flashlights, Melissa often sat alone, staring blankly at the lake or standing with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. One woman told detectives she found it unusual that Melissa never cried openly. Another said she made a chilling remark about how calm the water looked that evening, as though she were detached from the chaos around her. These weren't enough to prove anything, but they lingered in the minds of investigators, especially when paired with new information discovered through technology. Detectives obtained Melissa's phone records and internet history. What they found changed the course of the investigation. In the weeks leading up to Ethan's disappearance, Melissa had searched disturbing phrases: how long can a child survive underwater, drowning accidents with toddlers, and fastest ways to die without pain. Investigators were stunned. These weren't the actions of a mother fearful for her child's safety. They were the kind of searches that suggested planning. Alongside the searches, her text messages revealed frustrations. Melissa often wrote to friends about how exhausted she felt as a single mother. She complained about the constant responsibility and hinted at feeling trapped. While many parents have moments of overwhelm, the combination of her words, her searches, and her behavior during the search for Ethan created a troubling picture. Detectives also revisited the timeline of the day Ethan vanished. Melissa claimed she had been folding laundry inside the house while her son played in the yard. Yet neighbors didn't recall seeing him outside that afternoon. A review of surveillance cameras from nearby homes showed no sign of Ethan leaving the property alone. Instead, one camera captured Melissa's car leaving the driveway around the time she later reported him missing. Ethan was not visible on the footage, but the timing raised serious questions. The more investigators examined the case, the less they believed this was a tragic accident. Every detail seemed to nudge them toward a darker possibility that Melissa had deliberately taken her son to the lake. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the weight of it was growing. Detectives began to realize they weren't just investigating how Ethan had died, but why and if their suspicions were correct. The truth hiding beneath Melissa's calm exterior was far more chilling than anyone in Ridgewater wanted to imagine. The turning point in the investigation came when detectives obtained surveillance footage from cameras positioned near the Ridge Lake parking lot. One camera, mounted on a lamppost, showed Melissa's car pulling in just hours before she reported Ethan missing. The timestamp matched the period when she claimed to be at home doing laundry. Investigators watched carefully as the vehicle sat for several minutes before leaving again. What was most alarming was that Ethan was never seen walking independently near the lake, nor was there any sign of him arriving there on his own. To detectives, this footage suggested that Melissa had transported him herself. Armed with this new lead, officers expanded their search for physical evidence. In Melissa's car, they discovered damp spots on the back seat, faint traces that were later tested and confirmed to be consistent with lake water. The placement of the moisture suggested that something wet, or someone wet, had been inside shortly before the car was abandoned at home, combined with the surveillance video. The discovery was enough to convince detectives they were moving closer to the truth. The medical examiner's full report added another layer of certainty. Ethan's lungs confirmed drowning, but other details were far more unsettling. The lack of debris or mud on his clothing, the absence of scrapes or bruises that would normally accompany a fall into the rocky lake banks, and the uniform condition of his body all pointed to one conclusion: he had not stumbled into the water by accident. It was as if he had been placed deliberately into the lake, carefully enough to avoid leaving marks of a struggle on the outside. Investigators returned to Melissa with their findings. Initially, she stuck to her story, insisting Ethan must have wandered away while she was distracted. But when detectives laid out the evidence the internet searches, the strange behavior during the search, the surveillance footage, and the water traces in her car, her composure began to waver. Still, she did not show the emotional breakdown most would expect from an innocent parent accused of harming their child. Instead, she grew quiet, offering short and measured responses that only deepened the detective's suspicion. What finally shattered the case was a chilling realization shared during a late-night strategy meeting. A senior investigator pointed out that everything about Melissa's actions, from her online research to her calm demeanor during the search, fit the profile of someone who had carefully planned what she was about to do. She had not acted in a moment of panic, but had instead carried out a deliberate decision. It was this conclusion that pushed the team to treat the case no longer as a tragic accident, but as a calculated crime. The discovery shook even the most seasoned officers. Many had children of their own and struggled to comprehend how a mother could harm her child in such a way. The story that had begun as a town-wide search for a missing boy was now unraveling into something unthinkable: a mother deliberately driving her son to the lake, leading him to the water's edge, and letting him slip beneath the surface. The investigation that had once been about finding a child alive had now become about uncovering the darkest truth possible. When detectives finally confronted Melissa with the full weight of their evidence, there was no dramatic outburst, no storm of denial. Instead, she sat quietly, her face pale, her hands folded on the table. After hours of silence and short replies, she gave a flat confession that stunned everyone in the room. She admitted to driving Ethan to Ridge Lake that day, carrying him down to the water, and forcing him into it. She claimed she had been overwhelmed, exhausted by the demands of raising a child alone, and convinced herself that ending his life was somehow a release for them both. The words were delivered without tears, without hesitation, as though she were describing something ordinary rather than an unthinkable act. The courtroom months later was filled to capacity. Journalists lined the back row, sketch artists captured each detail, and townspeople who had once brought food to the Parkers after Ethan's disappearance now sat in stunned silence as the trial unfolded. The prosecution presented a clear picture: a mother who meticulously planned her son's death, whose internet searches revealed preparation, whose behavior showed detachment, and whose actions placed Ethan directly in the lake. The defense attempted to argue mental instability and desperation, suggesting Melissa was too overwhelmed to know what she was doing. But the jury was unconvinced. The evidence was too precise, the timeline too clear, the planning too deliberate. When the verdict was read, the silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Melissa Parker was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Some jurors later admitted they had never seen a case where the decision felt so heavy, not just because of the crime but because of the betrayal it represented. A mother was supposed to protect her child, not deliver him into danger. For Ridgewater, the verdict marked both closure and devastation. The truth had been revealed, but it was a truth no one wanted. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to recover. Families who had once gathered joyfully at Ridge Lake now avoided it. The shoreline became a place of mourning rather than leisure. A small group of neighbors placed flowers, stuffed animals, and candles along the edge of the water. Over time, it grew into a permanent memorial, a quiet reminder of the boy who should have had years ahead of him but was silenced before he had the chance. Ethan's red tricycle, saved by a neighbor, was placed at the site as a symbol of the childhood that had been stolen. For many residents, the tragedy forced a reckoning. The illusion that Ridgewater was immune to darkness had been shattered forever. Parents held their children closer, neighbors checked in on one another more often, and whispers of distrust lingered in the air. What had once been a picture-perfect small town was now marked by the memory of an unthinkable crime. Melissa's conviction ensured justice under the law, but the emotional wounds she left behind would take much longer to heal. Ethan's name became a reminder that evil can sometimes hide in the most familiar places, and that even the safest-looking waters can conceal unimaginable depths.